Hello, everyone. Thank you for the excellent discussion last week. It was really nice to see you all pull in some of the outside sources from other countries that we don't necessarily get to see a lot in the United States. And I think that's pretty typical and probably fairly intentional. We have a pretty all consuming mass media market, depending on how much information you want, as opposed to how much propaganda you want, as well as what kind of bias you want. If you want, far left, middle left, center, fairly neutral, right, far right. We have a plethora of options that you can choose from, as I think some of you are starting to see in your journals already. So it was really nice to kind of get that international perspective a bit. And I think one of the main takeaways that I'd like to see from that discussion is just understanding that I think what we picture media to be necessarily in other countries isn't always necessarily the case. I think we have this built up idea in the United States that if your media outlet is funded by the government, that the message is then controlled by the government. And as many of you pointed out, especially in other democratic Western countries, that's not true. There are very often cases, France, Germany, Canada, the UK, these state-funded media outlets are also then required to be neutral. That they are not required to, convey or to parrot or comment on the political positions necessarily of leaderships or of a specific party. They'll very often broadcast, the message of, say, Boris Johnson. They'll broadcast that without commentary on it, unless to occasionally fact check. So I think it gives us a little bit different perspective than necessarily what we were expecting to see as we look outside of the United States. So keep all of that in mind as we turn back to, looking at the effects that media can have here in the US. All of that is going to be very important because it gives us some context of maybe some of the issues that are influencing these different areas. This week, I'd like to talk about public opinion and how that is influenced by the media. You may imagine right off the bat that that's a pretty big interaction, especially as we, have moved into an era where we hear from certain politicians that the, media is the enemy of the public, and, other institutions and other politicians who say that the media is the last bastion of truth in our society. Those kind of polarized, opposites, I think, give us a certain viewpoint that we tend to take on this issue. And that's not always necessarily accurate. It's traditional, political science research that media doesn't really influence public opinion at all. Now, obviously, I don't think that's entirely correct. There are certainly instances, and we'll get to those. There are instances in which the media does have a pretty significant influence. But under traditional research, political science primarily looked at whether media was changing people's opinions. If you tuned into the news, you heard a story, did your opinion of something or, of someone, you're a politician, an event, government, did that opinion shift because of, listening to media or even to listening to one specific media source? And political science, by and large, found that it didn't. Kind of contrary, I think, to some of our perception of things. Most campaigns don't actually change minds. The campaigns that you see on television, when you see political ads, and here in the United States we have to put up with them for months, if not years, before an actual election. And I say that because, you may have come across it or you may find it fascinating in other countries that don't require or don't even allow that same level of campaigning. For instance, in Germany, you're allowed to put up political posters 2 months before the actual election itself. And that's it. Um, so if you're running for political office, you don't go buy television ads. You can't. The networks literally won't sell them to you. You make political posters. They're designated in their size. It's specified by the German government, and you put those posters up in areas where you're trying to get political attention, and you do that for 2 months, and then Germany holds the election. So very different approach. We kind of are used to this very drawn out and very expensive public ads campaign, and political science research just shows that that does not change people's minds. Seeing a TV ad doesn't it isn't going to change the average person's mind on a political candidate. Mostly what that's doing is it's feeding back into this, core concept we established at the beginning of class, which is that, image is everything. And along with image goes name recognition. If you see a political ad and you are a Democrat and the political ad says, I'm, Joe Biden and I'm running for the Democratic Party, that is a cue to you that, your values allegedly will mostly align with the values of this candidate. Same thing on the Republican Party side. It's getting the name out there so that the people who are already predisposed to agreeing with that person will have that cue that they should agree with that person. The same goes for presidential debates. It is always fascinating to me when we look back in history. Very often we'll talk about like the Nixon-Kennedy debates. There's even debate in political science over whether those had any actual effect on the outcome. We always talk about it as sort of, this key moment in the evolution of understanding public figures and their public perception. You hear that allegedly people who heard it on the radio believed that Nixon won the debate. People who saw it on TV believed that Kennedy won the debate because, the appearance that they had was different. Kennedy was willing to put on makeup, even though this was very early in, the television era. He was willing to wear makeup, whereas opposed to Nixon looked kind of washed out and, greasy. I've read all of these different things about, the effect of these debates. But that was truly, I think, an effect on the perception of the candidates, not actually changing anything about the way that people would then go to vote in the election. And that is what we've found to be increasingly true. Debates don't change people's minds. Debates do a very good job of reaffirming for partisans the beliefs that they may think a candidate should hold. Unless you have one extremely salient issue, and that is something to understand. Issue saliency for individuals can be different than it is for necessarily the public. If you have one extremely salient issue, like let's say you think that in Wyoming, you think that you may be a Democrat, but you truly strongly believe that we need to move away from focusing our economy on the oil production in this state. It is a huge aspect of our economy. It's one of the major producers for economic revenue. And you maybe hear someone like Mary Throne, who ran for governor. You hear her say something to the effect of oh well, I very much so still support the oil industry, and we want to continue bolstering that economic revenue. If that issue is very key to you, then it may cause you to look at other candidates. Of course, you're gonna maybe look across the aisle at the Republican candidates for governor and not see any different views. So in the long run, it's probably not going to change who you're voting for. But on a national scale, you take all of those issues, you put them all in aggregate, you have two primary parties, and I know that we do have third parties in this country. The system will absolutely never allow a third party to win the presidency, and that's just a fact of the Electoral College and our first past the post voting system. But we do have those third parties, so maybe you maybe turn to them if you see something that puts you so off of a candidate. But by and large, we're looking at those debates really just to know who it is that represents your party. And that may not be true for each of you individually. You know, obviously you are better informed politically than most people in the country. For most people, that daily influence doesn't matter. You know, the issue saliency is something that they're not well educated on. They are looking at political parties as a shortcut for who to vote for if they're part of that, 60% of the population that goes and votes. All of those are really major, facts to understand about our historical understanding of political campaigns. That then, would lead to the assumption that media doesn't really have that much of an effect on the political process. And for a very long time, that's how political science understood it. Obviously, we've kind of started to evolve a better understanding. And that understanding comes from looking past just voting influence. Asking the question, does the media affect the way that people vote, isn't a good question. It's only one small aspect of the way the media can influence people's opinions and public opinion as we, look at it in larger aggregate. The ways, then, that it can influence it, the sort of new understandings, the better questions to ask, are where we really want to focus for the sake of this course. The first aspect is that media assists with learning. So, basic information provision, right? If you want to be informed on a political issue, where do you go? You're probably going to Google it. You may start off on Wikipedia because, let's be honest, it's a good place to start if you want a broad overview of stuff. Never cited in an academic paper because it's not a, very legitimate source. But then you can always scroll down to the bottom of that Wikipedia article and look at the sources that are cited in it. And most of them are going to be major media outlets. You'll see in that Google search, you'll see in that Wikipedia article, you'll see if you have a preferred method of gaining, information on political issues, whether it's, a specific network, whether it's The Daily Show, or Saturday Night Live, or, something that gives you your political information. You can learn through these media outlets. And so there is a vested interest in media outlets providing accurate information. And that, I think, in the context of the past 4 years, means we also have to bring up the idea of alternative facts. Alternative facts simply don't exist. I apologize if that seems offensive to anyone, but we can attain actual facts. And there are news outlets that report those actual facts. When you see a news article from something like the Associated Press, that news article, it says Associated Press is the author for a reason. It doesn't identify a single specific author because it has been vetted by multiple authors who are all dedicated to ensuring that the information in that is as non-biased as possible, that it is as close to factual reporting as possible. That does exist in our society, and we can gain that information. It doesn't matter what a politician says. If they are reporting the facts, then I think that's wonderful. Very often that may not be the case. That's not even always a partisan thing. We do see that out of both parties, and so in that instance, I think it's very important to add to this point that the media can serve as a fact checker on politicians. Now, it's also fair to recognize that it has been primarily primarily conservative viewpoints expressed through the Republican Party that have introduced this idea of, alternative facts into our political discourse. But we just have to sift through those to understand what's really going on in political issues. And that sometimes means reevaluating the media sources that an individual subscribes to. If your media source is always parroting, alternative facts, that things like, just for a few that come up over, that have come up over the past few years, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. Obviously, we use the Electoral College, which is why Donald Trump was elected president, but Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. Donald Trump's inauguration size was not larger than Obama's. It was not better attended. Russia was proven to have influenced the 2016 elections through mass social media implementation. It's proven. It's been researched by the Senate. It's been confirmed by judicial inquiry. These sort of things that are factual statements. It's very difficult to then sort those out sometimes, depending on which media sources you're using. And if it is a media source that you trust a lot and you're not getting that factual information, well, then it means that you're not going to be learning what those facts are. Hopefully, again, you as educated individuals in a university setting are, reaching past that level. But for a casual individual who doesn't want to necessarily take the time to learn that factual information, it can be very misleading to have that out in our media world. The second thing that media outlets can do is agenda setting. So even if media outlets were perfect and they covered the facts all the time, didn't express anything that was not factual, didn't comment on the things that they're saying, so they present a fact and then they tell you what that means, even if they didn't do any of that, they're still setting the agenda for public knowledge by what they choose to cover. So, for instance, we have this very recent occurrence where the State Department has spoken about getting involved in Myanmar. For a lot of people, that was new information, that there is an event going on in Myanmar that may need a U.S. intervention. That, I think, is in large part due to the choice of coverage. There's been a lot going on domestically that is very important and very important to people, and the media chooses to cover that. There was, obviously an insurrection followed by an impeachment trial. Those are huge, very directly impactful news items that have to do with the United States. And in that time, we typically do see a decrease in international coverage, covering the events that are happening around the world that may still be very important, but we're, essentially mostly focused on, us at the moment. And so, that suddenly comes as a surprise to many people. And, that sort of picking and choosing of what stories to cover, even if those stories are then covered, perfectly in terms of factual accuracy, you're still influencing public opinion by choosing what those items are. In relation to this, there's two other concepts that the media engages in, and that's priming and framing. So priming is essentially establishing for your audience how they may judge current events and how they may judge politicians. So, think of this in terms of an extension of that agenda setting. If you as a major media source, if you always cover the economy, right at the top of your news hour, you're always talking about the economy. Well, then when it comes to, how you may judge or how your audience may judge the performance of a president, for instance, the first thing that they may think of is the economy. Does the economy, is it doing well under this individual? that was something that, the past few presidents really have capitalized on. Under George Bush, our economy, struggled. It moved into Obama and was in a pretty dismal place. And that is in a lot of ways not in any way the fault of the president. It wasn't George Bush's fault that the economy struggled. It wasn't entirely Obama's fault that the economy recovered. He was, responsible for implementing some of the directional changes from the executive branch, but the president doesn't single-handedly control the economy. President Trump, for most of his tenure, had an extremely strong economy and implemented some of the programs that helped it to remain that way, and truly rode on the success of the economy for much of his presidency. It wasn't really until the pandemic and the near economic collapse we've entered since that the presidential sort of connection with the economic success of the United States was severed. So we see these things where the media is helping to prime voters in how they're engaging with candidates, what their expectations of candidates are. That also then ties into the concept of framing, how a news station, a media outlet may frame an issue can have some of those very same effects. If the news in I think a good example of this may be in the coverage of the pandemic, even just looking at a factual statistic like the mortality rate of COVID. It sits in the United States at approximately 1.8% of the total cases that occur. So, how you frame that, I think, determines a lot of your perspective on COVID. If you frame that as, here is a virus that has, roughly 4 to 6 times the mortality rate of, the seasonal influenza virus. Okay, that sounds like it's a pretty serious event. If you say, only 1.8% of people who get it die, that kind of minimizes what that effect might be. If you say you have, a 98.2% chance of surviving if you get COVID, again, overall, we're not even talking about specific subgroups within that. That sounds like maybe it's not as big of a deal. Or if you say that roughly 500,000 Americans have died in less than a year, which is more already than died during the entirety of World War II, that puts it in a different perspective. All of these are different perspectives based on the same statistical data. And so the way that media frames issues goes back into this cycle, I think. And that's the thing I really want to get to overall, if you wanted one main point of today's conversation, is that, the media is not independent. It is in a feedback loop with the public. So it influences public opinion. It does. It has, through these various settings, it can help to influence public opinion. But public opinion also then is maybe reflected in is the contributing attribute of media. They are covering things that seem to be important in the public. And in the United States, we have a very interesting way of doing that, which is just the fact that all of our media is private. We don't have that major publicly funded and governmentally funded media source that doesn't have to chase ratings. Even PBS, which is the closest thing we have because it does receive some government funding, it still has to have a large viewership. So it has to select, it has to set agendas, it has to frame, it has to move through all of these different attributes in a way that gives it a larger audience. And that's the long and short of it, is that there is a drive for viewership. There's a drive for people who will listen to your media outlet above others, people who will subscribe, people who will, click on your article. All of those things are major influences in the United States. And so this, final point that we have to talk about, which is the persuasion aspect of media. Because of that, because you have the ability as a media outlet in the United States to cater to specific viewpoints. We have, sort of that central core that's really dedicated to factual reporting. That's things like the Associated Press that, are dedicated to that, essentially subcontract with other media outlets so that there's that factual reporting to base things on. When you move outside of that, you can cater to specific audience viewpoints. And the persuasion that comes out of that is then not persuading people to take a different viewpoint. You're not trying to get Democrats to suddenly become Republicans. You're trying to persuade the people within your same group of what's important and the way that they should feel about it. And that is, where we sort of devolve into this negative relationship between, media and the groups that they serve, the American public itself. Because if you are trying to persuade too much, if you are, not just setting the agenda, but if you are establishing the facts or the alternative facts, then that becomes a negative relationship. And that I think is where you start to see this belief or the projection of the media being the enemy of the people. It comes out of a view or an intentional usage of that view that the media is trying to persuade people into a certain belief, as opposed to engaging in these other more natural, more positive, potentially more dignified ways that media can approach the news. So to, wrap up all of that, and I think carry us into our discussion for the week, I'd like you to again engage in, a little bit of your own personal experience. What's something from your life, maybe something from the past 4 years to make it a little bit easier to remember? What's a major news story that got out there that you think missed the mark on one of these areas? Whether it be agenda setting, whether there was something more important going on, maybe it's the priming that you saw news outlets doing, maybe it's the way that they framed an issue. What's a major news story that you felt media missed the mark in these cases? And with that, why? Why is it that they may have missed that mark? Do you think, is it based on money? Is it viewership? Is it catering to a specific audience that maybe they should have selected differently? Something like that. Off of that, then, what do you think would have fixed that? What in our system, what kind of systemic change could we make to improve on the media's ability to engage properly with these goals? That's the discussion I'd like to hit for this week. I hope you have a wonderful day. If you're watching this on Monday, take the day off. I think it's supposed to be a holiday. I know that those kind of don't... I feel like they don't really exist anymore with online stuff, but I want to encourage you not to post if you can avoid it today. I know some people like to work ahead, but otherwise don't. Take the day off, really take that time for yourself, because we get few enough holidays on this new schedule. So do that. We'll talk about this over the course of the week. Also, to remind you, next week will be the first learning in practice event post for you. I'd like you to record a video in a news report in the style of the news outlet that you're covering. So, have some fun with this. This doesn't need to be the most serious coverage, but I do want you to attempt to take some of what you've learned so far in your journals, how this media outlet fits into our fabric of public media. Use that in this news report. We'll post those in a special discussion thread next week that'll constitute our discussion, so you'll be able to hop on and talk about other students' videos. It doesn't need to be long, just a couple of minutes, and the details are all up on our website. So I hope you have a wonderful week, and I'll see you in the discussion. Thanks.